Edexcel 2019, paper 1, of course the microeconomics paper. Let's get right on with it and get started with this section A. So going straight to the question, first one is a 2-mark question. With reference to the data provided, calculate the price elasticity of supply, so the PES, for new house builds between 2016 and 2017. You're advised to show your workings. What does it say in the stem? Between 2016 and 2017, the average price of new builds in the UK rose by estimated 5.4%. So the price rose from 5.4%. So of course, let's get started with PES. So what is the formula for PES? Of course, it's percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. So first things first, let's work out the percentage change in quantity supplied. So of course, if we look from 2016 to 2017, the quantity supplied has increased from 162,000 to 134,000. So how would we work this out? Of course, first thing first, let's just take 162,880, take that away from 134,612. And that would give us 28,268. So what we're going to do with this 28,268, so this is the change between 2017 and 2018. Now, of course, we need to divide that by the original to work out the percentage change, which, of course, what is the original? It is obviously 2016. So divide that by 134,612. That's going to give us 0.2, so I'm going to round that up to, as a percentage change, so that's 20.9%. So I'm going to round that up to, so we'll write like this, times 100, so 21%. I'm going to round that up to. So now we need to work out what is the last thing we need to work out. We need to work out the percentage change in price, which of course is actually given. It's given here. So 5.4% prices, house prices rose. So the last step is we do 21, which is the percentage change in quantity supplied, and we divide it by 5.4%, which should give us somewhere around the number 4, I believe. Yes, that gives us 3.88, which I'm going to round up to 3.89, which would be our PES, and that is how to get 2 marks on this question. So let's keep going, and it's a multiple choice question now. So a 2.5% increase in the new build house prices in one region of the UK suggests a 10% increase in the number of houses built. Ceteris paribus, this suggests the supply of houses. Assuming ceteris paribus, this suggests the supply of houses is what? So let's see what's happening here. The prices of houses have increased, therefore the supply of houses have increased. What does that suggest in terms of supply? Of course, that suggests what? It suggests elastic supply. And why is that? Since why would suppliers start supplying more higher prices? As of course they have a profit incentive. Therefore, if prices increase, that means supply will increase, which is classic. It means suppliers are responsive to an increase in price. Therefore, we would say this is relatively elastic supply. If prices increase 2.5% and supply only increase like 0.1%, then that would represent inelastic supply. Why is that? Since producers are not responsive to increases in price. Yeah, the answer there would be C. All the rest of them are wrong. Why is it not? It's obviously not perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic, and we've already ruled out inelastic. Therefore, let's keep going in this question. So another 2-marker, and it's an explain here. Explain one factor that is likely to determine the price elasticity of supply of new house builds. And this is why your early units, these are pretty much, this is things you pretty much learn in the first few lessons of your economics. But like here, this is the real A-level paper where you are being assessed on essentially the factors which affect price elasticity of supply. So of course, if you think about new house builds, what do we build houses with? Raw materials. So my answer here would be availability of raw materials. And why is that? And remember, this is an explains question, so why is that? As that is, of course, if there's a lack of bricks, it means how is it going to affect the supply? It's going to mean the supply is inelastic. Why is that? As even if the prices are increasing of houses, it means that if there's a lack of supply of bricks, it means builders literally cannot build houses. Therefore, there will not be a responsive increase in quantity supplied, even though prices are increasing. Yeah, so this is basically written availability of raw materials, e.g. bricks, as if shortage of bricks, even if the price of houses increase, quantity supplied will not increase proportionally, as the main constraint will be the bricks, thus suggesting inelastic supply. That is how to get 5 out of 5 marks on that question 1. And let's keep going to this question 2. So it looks like we have a diagram question here. We love a diagram question. The reason why I love it, you can do it very quickly and very easy marks. So draw a supply and demand diagram to show the microeconomic effects of a hurricane on the US oil market. So hurricane is probably going to destroy the supply, so therefore I'm suggesting probably a decrease in supply. And what does it say? In 2017, Hurricane Harvey caused closure, so closure, so therefore it's going to affect supply of nearly a quarter of the oil production in the United States. This is, of course, a very simple question, so let's make sure we don't drop any stupid marks. So price and quantity on our axis, supply, so supply, shifting to supply plus 1, supply plus 1, or you can put supply plus hurricane, whatever you want to name it. Then we have our demand curve, of course, demand. Main thing to remember, label up the two equilibriums. So this is, of course, the first equilibrium, we have Q1, we have price P1, and then the second equilibrium, we have Q2, and now P2, and just represent what's going to happen. So of course, when there's reduction in supply, it means quantity will decrease and price will also be increase from P1 to P2. That is literally as that. You can get 4 marks here in pretty much 20 seconds. This is why these questions are so good, and if you get a diagram question, you should be quite happy that you can save so much time and then use that later on in the paper. Now let's keep it moving. So we have a multiple choice question here. It looks like it's PPF question. So the diagram show movements from the position X to Y on the PPF. In which one of the diagrams does the movement from X to Y illustrate the most likely impact on the US economy of a natural disaster of I can't speak. And let's keep going and finish off this question too. So we have a 1 mark question, a multiple choice question to finish this off. So the diagrams show movements, and it looks like we have a few PPF diagrams here. So the diagrams show movements from position X to Y on a production possibility frontier. In which one of the diagrams does the movement from X to Y illustrate the most likely impact on the US economy of a natural disaster such as Hurricane Harvey? So essentially, how is Hurricane Harvey going to affect a PPF? And very simply, of course, it's going to reduce the maximum production potential of an economy. So what we're looking for, we're looking from a shift in from, like it says, from point X to point Y. Straight away we can rule out B, Y, since of course the production potential of the economy is increasing, and if we've just been hit by a natural disaster, that is of course not what's going to be happening. Here from X to Y, we're just moving along our curve, nothing's really changing, we're just changing them up, we're reallocating our resources, you could say. So yep, it would not be this, it does not show the impacts of a natural disaster. And from on D, of course, it's just showing something that is impossible. We're moving to a point that we cannot achieve, and yet again, it's not showing a shift in, therefore that would be A. So this is a really easy question, and had to get 5 out of 5 marks on that question 2. And let's keep going on to this question 3. So straight on to the question. The UK and hair beauty industry is an example of monopolistic competition because, and let's just have a read of the stimulus. According to the Royal Mail, more hair and beauty salons opened on UK high streets last year than any other type of independent business. Okay, with a net increase of 10%, representing 626 new salons. Now that is a good bit of real world application you can use in your essays if you are talking about a monopolistic competition. But now back to the question, why is the hair and beauty industry an example of monopolistic competition? Since firms spend nothing on advertising and research. That is not necessarily true, so we're going to say no for now for this one. Let's go on to B. The industry is dominated by a few large firms. That is, of course, and we know that for certain, that is not true. Why? A few large firms would suggest something more like an oligopolistic market. Of course, monopolistic markets, a really good way to remember monopolistic competition is it's very similar, and I usually teach it as a realistic version of perfectly competitive markets. If you remember back to perfectly competitive markets, then it's many buyers and sellers, and monopolistic is essentially the same, where there's many buyers and sellers, therefore the market is not dominated by a few large firms. Let's move on to see. The products are homogeneous. This is also untrue. And this is exactly why I teach students monopolistic competition. A really easy way to remember it is it's a realistic version of perfectly competitive markets. Perfectly competitive markets, we say the goods are homogeneous, so all goods are the same. Is this realistic? No. Therefore, like I said, monopolistic is the realistic version. Therefore, in monopolistic competition, the goods are slightly differentiated. So that's a really good way to remember it. But now let's go to the last option, which is D. There are low barriers to entry and exit. That is true. And again, contrasting it with perfectly competitive markets, we say the theoretical concept of perfectly competitive markets, they have no barriers to entry and exit. But is that realistic? Of course, it's not. Therefore, the realistic version of that, which is monopolistic competition, is that there's very low barriers to entry and exit. But yeah, that's a good way to remember that. But let's keep going. And we have another diagram question. We've been blessed again. So now, draw a cost and revenue diagram to show the long-run equilibrium of a firm in monopolistic competition. Now, what does it mean by long-run equilibrium? All this, of course, means is to do with the profits, and it essentially is when a monopolistically competitive firm will make no supernormal profits, it will only make normal profits. So now let's show that on the diagram. So let's get started. Cost/revenue on our axes, output, quantity, whatever you want to label on your x-axis, and just, of course, simple, whatever you want to call it, monopoly cost-revenue diagram. So D equals AR, and essentially the main rule that you just need to follow here with regards to the long run equilibrium is the main thing is that your AC curve just hits your AR curve. So that's probably a very bad representation of it. Something like that will do. So just moving the D equals AR further in so it looks a bit better. But yeah, so and then just make sure your MC curve, of course, still intersects AC at its lowest point. MC, and now what is the last thing we need to add on here? Just add on the profit maximization point. Where is profit maximization? Of course, where MC equals MR. Where's this point here? What do we do from there? We keep going until we hit our AR curve. Then we go left, and now label up the quantities. That's Q max, that is P max. But now where are our costs? Of course, we go up from Q max to find our costs, and now our costs are exactly the same as P max price. Therefore, what does that mean? It means we are only making normal profit and we are making no supernormal profit. And yeah, that is how to get 4 marks there, and that's a very easy another question. So 5 out of 5 there. And let's keep going here to this next question. So we have multiple choice. So the most likely reason for this demerger. So we're talking about a demerger. Let's have a read of the stimulus. In 2016, the insurance group eSure undertook a demerger with its GoCompare price comparison site website. Just asking for reasons for demergers. Why do firms demerge? It's usually to focus on their own business objectives. And because, for example, when PayPal and eBay demerged, I believe it's 2015. Why did they do that? Because they wanted to they wanted to become separate entities. So PayPal can, of course, focus on like the finance side of things, and eBay can focus on like the shopping side of things. But yeah, let's try to find this in this multiple choice. So the most likely reason for this demerger was to benefit from external economy scale. That is the reason you would merge, so that is not true. Benefit from internal economy scale, of course, that's another reason why you would merge, not demerge. Focus on its core business, that is pretty much what I said earlier, so yes, that would probably be the answer here. And increases market share. Of course, let's think about it very simply. If you demerge, you will be losing market share, so that would be a reason to merge. But yeah, let's keep going now, and it's a 4-mark question, a 4-mark calculate question here. So you calculate, using the information provided, the total costs of GoCompare in 2016. Okay, let's see this information it's given us. Following the demerger, GoCompare announced in 2017 a profit of 17.5 million, up 21.5% from 2016. Total revenue in 2017 was 75.8 million, up 4.1% in 2016. So okay, so essentially what is assessing us on is here, it's firstly percentage changes, and then our knowledge of the formula of profits. So how do we calculate profits? Profits is, of course, total revenue minus total cost, and that's pretty much what the 4 marks are here for. So let's get started with the total revenue. And of course, the main thing is, of course, this is why it's a big 4-mark question. It's asking us in 2016, and it's giving us all the stats and figures from 2017. So let's start with the total revenue. So total revenue in 2017 was 75.8 million. And that is up 4.1% since 2016. So how am I going to work out the total revenue in 2016? So what I'm going to do is going to take 75.8 million, and I'm going to divide it by 104.1. Why am I dividing by 104.1? Since, of course, it's up 4.1%. So that means I've just taken 100% and added 4.1% to it. So I'm going to take 75.8 million, divided by 104.1%, and then times it by 100. So that should tell me now. That should tell me now what it was before it increased by 4.1%. So essentially what the value was in 2016. And that gives me 72.81. That is going to be my revenue in 2016. So 72, and this of course in millions, remember, 72.81, and that I'm going to put that pound sign, millions. So I've got my total revenue now. What do I need now? So we want to calculate the costs. So we have but now, of course, we have this part of the equation. We now need, what other part of the equation do we need? We need the profits, and let's see what's it told us with the profits. In 2017, the profits were of 70.5 million, which is up 21.5% since 2016. So essentially we're doing the same thing. So 17.5 million, we are now dividing it by 121.5% essentially, and then timing it by 100. So essentially now that is how to work out the profits in 2016. So let's put that into the calculator, and that is going to give us 14.40. and of course that is millions again. So now how would we work out the rest of this? Now it's just a bit, I won't even call it algebra since it's that simple, but we have 40.4 and we have 17.81, and then essentially we have x. So 72.81 take away x will give us 40.4. X is what our total costs are. So how would we work this out? Of course, what you can do is just do 72.81 take away 14.4, and that is going to give us 58.41, which is of course the value for x, but that is also the value for our total costs. So 58.41, and that is of course millions, so that is going to be my answer. So 58.4, put that millions, and yeah, that is how to get 4 marks there. It's actually, if you break down, a very, very simple and quite an easy question. It's just using a few different parts of the specs. Of course, your knowledge of the profits formula, then basically a few percentage changes. But yeah, quite an easy question and really easy, like a really good section here so far. Like you can save a lot of time so far in this section here. This is why practice is so key, where you can really have a great surplus of time moving out of section here. But yeah, let's go on to the last question in this section here. It's a 5-mark question. It's 2 mark here. So explain how resources are allocated in a free market economy. Let's have a read of the stimulus. Free market economics is being challenged. The arguments for and against are being increasingly discussed within many countries. So of course this last question is referencing a very small part of the spec, which is 1.1.6. But what is the free market economy? Of course, it's just where essentially you leave it to the market. So how are resources allocated? It depends on the interaction, supply and demand. It depends on the interaction of the price mechanism, essentially. And the main thing is there's no such very limited government intervention. And of course, when you learn about the price mechanism, you learn about the things like the functions of the price mechanism, the 3 functions we learned about, which is signaling, incentivizing, and rationing. You can go into more depth with them. But of course, there's only 2 marks here, so you don't need to mention them much. Okay, let's keep going on this multiple choice question. So which of the following statements are true? So Hayek believed that the government should subsidize inefficient firms. So who are the 2 in the spec in 1.1.6? Who are the 2 individuals that promoted the free market economy? Of course, they were Hayek, and the other one was Adam Smith. So would an individual that wants basically Hayek was he was opposed to the command economy and promoted the free market economy. Therefore, free market economy, we do not want government intervention. Therefore, this is untrue, as of course this is including the government. Let's see what B says. So Hayek was a key advocate of the command economy. So like I just said, he was extremely opposed to the command economy. Okay, moving on, Karl Marx. So what did Karl Marx promote? Of course, Karl Marx was one of the promoters of the command economy. So let's try to find a statement regarding that. So Karl Marx advocated allocating resources by the free market. That, of course, is free market economics, and he did not promote that. And now D, Karl Marx criticized the private ownership of factories of production. That is true. Why is that? Because I wanted more like central planning in the command economy. So yeah, that is, so the answer would be D there. And let's keep going to the last 2 marker on this section here. So Adam Smith described the benefits of specialization and division of labour. Explain one advantage to firms for using the division of labour when organising its production process. This is why you need to make sure you have a good grasp on a wide range of the spec. Since again, look how early on this is in the spec. Lots of students neglect it because they think, oh, this is really early knowledge I learned in year 12, but you can drop very silly marks in very easy places. And of course, you do not want to be dropping marks on specialisation and division of labour. Instead of you becoming a jack of all trades, if you just do one thing your entire day, like for example, you just make the dough of the bread, you're gonna become very quickly. You're gonna become quite skilled at that. If you're very skilled at that one certain thing, of course, you're gonna be fast at producing it. Therefore, the main thing is going to reduce a firm's costs. It's going to increase productivity for the firm, and yeah, that's how to get 2 marks there and 5 out of 5 marks on this section here. This, in my opinion, is the easiest section here of every single paper I've done, and I've quite literally done every single paper. So yeah, that is a really, really easy section here, in my opinion. So it means that even if you are dropping marks, of course, solve the marks you're dropping. But the reason why I think it's so easy is that you can really save a lot of time on this section here due to it having 2 diagram questions in it. But yeah, let's keep going and let's now move on to section B. Section B, Edexcel 2019. Let's get right on with it and started with this question. So it looks like it's on the energy market sector. But yeah, 6A, 5-mark question. With reference to extract A, explain question the difference between a positive and a normative statement. So this looks like quite an easy 5-mark question, but let's have a look at section A. So what I'm looking for in section A is just some positive and some normative statements, since of course there will be a few application marks here, and then it should be a very simple question where you just explain the differences between positive and normative, give a few examples, and that should be fine. So first things first, we have an example of a positive statement. So it says the new legislation will the energy bills of 11 million households will be capped for as long as 5 years. Of course, that is a stat, that is a figure, that's something you can test. So of course that would be a positive statement. Claim it could save households hundreds of pounds a year. And remember, what is the difference between positive and normative statement? Positive statement, remember, the main thing is it does not have to be correct. The main thing is backed up by evidence. It can just be tested, and if it can be tested, like I said, it does not necessarily have to be correct. So even if this cap doesn't save households hundreds, it can be tested, therefore it's a positive statement, whilst of course normative statements are more opinion based. Here, so when it's said also in the title, but the market is broken, the Prime Minister says. So the Prime Minister repeated her claims that she had to act the market is broken. That is a very subjective statement where some people may think the market is functioning perfectly, or the market is partially broken. So therefore that is of course an opinion, and when it's an opinion, we of course would call it a normative statement. Then if we keep going, our broken energy market has to change. It has to offer fairer prices, and of course fair is a massive opinion. What one person deems fair is another person might deem it unfair. That, like I said, and it's another example of a normative statement. And again, if we keep going, a price cap will not be good for customers will not be good. It could be good for some customers, it might not be good for others. So again, that's an opinion that cannot necessarily be tested. How do we know it's not good for every single customer? But yeah, we've got enough there, and like I said, this 5-mark question is fairly simple. So I'm just going to quote about 1 or 2 of the bits of the extract, and that should be very easy 5 marks here. Okay, so that is what I'd write to get 5 marks there. So very simply, positive statement can be tested via stats/evidence. It does not have to be correct. Energy bills for 11 million households will be capped for 5 years. Then normative statements are opinion based. They cannot be tested and usually include a value judgment. E.g., fairer prices for customers who are paying. So of course fairer. This is a subjective statement. It stems from the individual's opinions. Actually, that's basically what value judgment is. Therefore, cannot be tested, and therefore is a normative statement. So it's very simple 5-mark question to make sure you get the application in to pick up those marks. And let's keep going and move on to the 8-mark question. So with reference to extract B, examine the likely benefits to consumers of the integration between BT and EE. So before we even actually look at extract B, what is going to be the benefits to consumers? A very simple question of the integration of basically 2 big mobile networks. First thing that comes to my mind is you will get almost like better mobile service, like you'll get service in better areas. And what would we call that in economics? Of course, it would just be better quality product. And then now let's think about it. So quality is also increasing. Let's think about price. If 2 of the biggest mobile networks are joining, you can almost say that the economies of scale will now join. And if they have larger economies of scale, they can exploit those economies of scale more. They can run down longer average costs further, therefore meaning that they can therefore have lower costs and charge consumers lower prices. And yeah, those are the main 2 benefits that come to my mind straight away. But let's have a read of this extract B and let's see what it's saying. So the first thing is that BT's profit rises, and let's see why this is happening. And the integration results in BT controlling 35% of the mobile consumer market. Of course, you could label it now as a legal monopoly. And its profit in the second quarter 2017. Good stats here, because of course for your 8-mark question, there will be marks for application. So yeah, this ties into what we were saying, like better service, where they're able to choose between BT, EE, or PlusNet. So whatever suits them best, so essentially meaning that they get a choice of 3 rather than just having 1. And then this acquisition enables us to create value bundles, so like that could link into the cheaper prices. So let's get started, and for the first paragraph I'm just going to talk about, since I think this is going to be the slightly chunkier paragraph, is going to be talking about the lower prices. And the application I'm going to use here is this. They're able to offer great value bundles, and that is going to tie into my price thing. Essentially, my main chain of analysis is going to be based on, like I said, economies of scale. So I'm going to say, with these firms like BT, EE merging, it's going to lead to now they're going to have larger joint economies of scale, therefore can further exploit these economies of scale. Then, of course, like I always say, I'm just going to give an example of one of the economies of scale, either being technical, purchasing. Purchasing probably works quite well here, since they can use that bulk buying power to run down their longer average costs. Lower costs, therefore, could mean it could be translated for consumers into lower price. Okay, so that's how I'd word that paragraph. So consumers will benefit from lower prices, e.g. able to offer great value bundles. That is a bit of application from the extract. With BT and EE merging means that joint larger economies of scale, e.g. purchasing economy of scale, buying in larger volumes, it increases the bargaining power, thus able to negotiate lower costs, so run down the LRAC. And lower costs can be translated, passed on to consumers via lower prices, thus increasing the consumer surplus, which is very easy, very standard paragraph here. And now let's move on to the evaluation. Of course, there's only 2 evaluation marks here, but let's try to pick them up. And of course, I think a really good one here is just with regards to, it talks about the market shares, the market share. BT and EE will now be classed as a legal monopoly. Therefore, of course, this means have monopoly power, and of course we're talking about the benefits to consumers. You could mention, however, in evaluation, this depends on BT and EE's monopoly power, as they now, with over 25% market share, as of 35%, they're classed as the legal monopoly, therefore could exploit consumers with higher prices, and there's like a slight lack of choices as they have that monopoly power. And of course, an even more specific one would be just talking about economies of scale, as in reality, joining these economies of scale will be quite difficult, and when the mergers do happen like this, it can lead to diseconomies of scale, and it's quite hard for example, the new teams to work together. It takes a bit of time for these to gel, and that would lead to initially diseconomies of scale. So that is how I write my second and my 2 evaluation points. Of course, kept them quite brief, didn't really. And that is just the 2 points. I haven't added any detail into the writing. But yeah, now let's move on to the second point, which is of course improvements in quality. So for this second paragraph, the way I'm going to develop the chain of analysis is essentially that the improvements in quality will be due to, as they merge, they have more monopoly power, they'll make larger supernova profits, they're going to invest these large supernova profits into R&D, and therefore, in the long run, it's going to lead to better quality products for the consumers. So they're going to use that supernova profit to invest into R&D, become innovative, and make these innovative products, meaning in the long run, better quality products. And of course, simplest evaluation is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. Why? As although they will be providing these better quality products in the long run, in the short run, they're going to use this monopoly power. They're going to exploit these consumers in the short run with higher prices. Thus, you can evaluate the long run benefits versus the short run costs. So essentially just dynamic efficiency. But yeah, a fairly simple and a fairly straightforward 8-mark question there. Quite a nice one, I would say. And yeah, moving on to this 10-mark question. With reference to extract C, assess possible reasons why many landline-only customers do not switch to a cheaper telephone provider. First thing that should pop into mind, very small part of spec, is to do with more behavioural economics. We call it consumer inertia. What is consumer inertia? Essentially, it's the concept where consumers do not switch to cheaper providers. Essentially, they're quite comfortable with the current provider. They can't really be bothered to switch, and they overestimate the cost of switching or how hard it is to switch. And this probably relates to you a lot, for example, with mobile providers. For example, no one really switches unless you're out of contract because it's just easier to remain. But what does this therefore mean? Consumer inertia, in the end of the day, this is a behavioural economics link, but what does it in the end lead to? It leads to a slight degree of inelastic demand. Why is that? Even if consumers aren't getting the best deal they could be, due to consumer inertia, it therefore will mean that these consumers will have a degree of inelastic demand. As like I said, they're paying higher prices than they should be paying. And then let's have a look at extract C for some other reasons. And even before looking at the extract, you can probably just think of some reasons. So why some people might not switch to a cheaper telephone provider. Try to think about the demographics of population. Like a lot of these questions, you can probably even deduce them without the extract. So let's have a look at this extract C. Okay, so this talks about the telephone only contract. It is falling about £7 a month after regulator attacked existing deals as poor value for money. This will save million landline customers £84 a year. And now this is a very interesting bit, because the bills for landline-only customers, nearly 2/3 of whom are over 65. Now, why is that interesting? Why is this demographic of this population interesting? As, of course, old people are not as teched up as young people. Therefore, how is that going to affect the ability to switch? Very simply, they don't have the information. It is definitely imperfect information, an information gap, asymmetric information. This is definitely an example of an information gap, as these elderly individuals do not have the correct information, don't know how to do it. Therefore, it means that they will end up overpaying. Thus, of course, that is a misallocation of resources. And then, of course, towards the bottom of this paragraph as well, so Ofcom focused on BT because it accounts for 2/3 of the 1.5 million landline-only customers. And then it talks about the dominant position of BT. So essentially, what is this talking about? It's essentially talking about monopoly power they have. And then essentially just talks about how BT is in prime position to exploit these customers. And a great stat to back this up, line rental charges have increased around 47% in the last few years, whereas the costs have fallen 27%. So they're really increasing their profit margins. And then towards the end, looking for measures to help people shop around for better deals with more confidence. Of course, that's a great link to things like price comparison sites, things like GoCompare. So first things first, what is inertia classed as? What do we learn it in the spec as? It is irrational behaviour, and it's irrational behaviour by consumers. Okay, and the example of inertia here I'm going to give is from the extract where it mentions, I believe it mentions 1/3 of BT's customers haven't yet. So one quarter of BT's landline customers have never switched. That is a great example for inertia. So what I'm going to say is that we assume in economics that consumers are rational. They make decisions to maximize their utility, and one thing that would maximize their utility in this scenario is lowering their costs. However, as we know, consumers, due to certain things, are irrational, and we can see that with, again, in the extract it mentions how the price of these lines, these landlines, have increased from around 23 to 47%, but individuals are still not switching. And why is that? Of course, that could be because they find it difficult to switch. They have brand loyalty. They just can't genuinely can't be bothered to switch. Therefore, it means despite BT increasing the price, the quantity demanded is not falling significantly. If you saw that on the diagram, of course, it would look something like this. Which, of course, what does that represent? Inelastic demand. So that's how I'd write that paragraph. Let's now move on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. So essentially, we're saying that they have inelastic demand as they continue paying higher prices, despite, even though they pretty much shouldn't be. But again, I'm going to evaluate this with a bit of application, which is right at the start of the extract, where it essentially says the Ofcom or the CMA is going to step in and is going to force the BT to drop its prices from £18.99 to £11.99. Thus, it basically means that consumers will not be being exploited and there's less inertia. As if now consumers are getting a good deal, there's no reason to switch, so they can comfortably stay with BT. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation by either Ofcom or CMA. So that's how to word that evaluation point there. Of course, you can go into a bit more depth with it, but now let's get started with our second paragraph. So the second paragraph, of course, is going to be on like the elderly side of things. So it's going to be on information gaps. You can go into specifics of which information gap you want to mention. You could mention like things like asymmetric information, incomplete information. But yeah. So my application here, I believe it says that either 1/3 or 1/4 of BT customers were, 2/3 of the landline customers were over 65, which of course is a great bit of application to use. So the next chain is going to be essentially just talk about how they struggle to access things like comparison sites like Go Compare due to a lack of digital literacy, and then of course why that leads to them sticking to the same deal. So I've just written that out just to help explain it. So due to information gaps, A.G 2/3 of BT landline customers are over 65. Therefore, they struggle to access things like comparison sites. Comparison sites is a really good thing to always mention. It links to a really good part of the spec of technological change. Of course, comparison sites are allowed for things like this, but of course they help solve that gap of information. But due to limited digital skills, it means they have incomplete information with regards to alternative providers and prices. This imperfect information, which is just another word for incomplete information, leads to a misallocation of resources, as these consumers are not aware of the lower cost decisions. Therefore, they allocate their resources incorrectly, as essentially, if they had complete information, if they knew all the prices in the market, it is likely that they would spend their money somewhere else. They'd spend it at a cheaper alternative, but as they have incomplete information, they have a lack of information. They will allocate their resources here, whereas in reality, therefore that meaning is a misallocation of resources. But yeah, that's a really good point. Now let's move on to evaluation. Now, I think a really good evaluation point here is kind of undermining BT to a massive extent, where I think in the previous paragraph we talked about one quarter of BT customers have never switched. But I think you could really evaluate that by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether there is a lack of information, whether the only reason consumers are not switching is due to the information gap, as consumers may actually just prefer BT, they may prefer the reliability, and they may just have a preference where they want to stick to BT. So we're just saying that 1/4 of consumers have never switched because of inertia, whereas that might not be true, or due to information gaps, where that might not be true, as they might just stick to BT as they have a good reputation. They like BT, for example, it's good customer service. So you could argue that it's actually it's to BT's credit rather than to consumers' downfall. And then a really good second evaluation point you can mention is on the time frame, where you could talk about digital literacy, essentially, where we say that these consumers, the elderly, they're not switching due to they don't have the digital literacy. But you could talk about in the long run, as like, for example, me, as we get older, we will have much better, and digital literacy with things like courses, things like campaigns is improving. Then we could talk about in the long run, digital literacy will improve, therefore information gaps will not be a reason why consumers do not switch. So in the short run, yes, this may be a problem, but in the long run, with digital literacy improving, it will therefore no longer be a problem. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. Moving on to this 12-mark question. discuss one likely reason for the rise in BT's profits. Using figure 2, extract B and C, and this is a good question, use a cost revenue diagram to support your answer. So if you've watched the question structure video, you know for 12 mark questions, this is an absolute gem. If it ever tells you to use a cost/revenue diagram, that means at least 8 of your marks are just analysis marks, just you talking about the diagram, you basically using the diagram dynamically, shifting the diagram, whatever it needs to be in this question. And it means it's a lot easier and simpler to pick up these 12 marks. So let's get right on with it. So let's break this down really simply. What is the formula for profits? Profits is, of course, revenue minus costs. So what can we do to boost profits? What are the 2 scenarios where profits will be boosted? Of course, we can either have increased revenue or we can have decreased costs. These are the 2 scenarios where we will see an increase in profits. Now let's have a read of these 2 extracts, B and C, to try and find where examples of where it's shown increases in revenue or decreases in costs. So that would be here, and let's have a look through this. So first line, BT Group reported a rise in profits as revenue increased. So that gives me my first indicator of what I am going to show, what I'm going to shift on this diagram. Since if revenue is increasing, of course, on our cost/revenue diagrams, we have a curve called D equals AR. So demand equals average revenue, which of course is therefore, if revenue is increasing, that means this is going to shift outwards. But now, if our D equals AR is shifting outwards, what curve does this also relate to? There's of course a direct relationship between D equals AR and then your MR curve. Since remember, the relationship is that MR is always twice as steep as your AR curve. That means now we can now conclude that both our D equals AR and our MR curve are both shifting out. And the big thing you need to make sure to remember with these cost revenue diagram questions, you have to make your diagram dynamic. Essentially what that means is shift a curve, shift 2 curves, shift as many curves as possible, as you will be limited to the lower levels. If you just show a monopoly diagram, just a D equals AR, just a normal monopoly diagram, you will be limited to the lowest level of KAY. Since these 12 mark questions, when they say use a cost revenue diagram, you need to be dynamic. But back to the extract, why are they experiencing this rise in revenue? Of course, it's just the integration, the merger between BT and EE was finalized, meaning that they're controlling more of the market share. If they're controlling more of the market, of course, they are therefore receiving increased demand, and increased demand therefore will cause increased revenue. Or a more step-by-step way you could put it, increased demand means more sales, you times the sales by the price, this will therefore give you increased revenue. And of course, we have had a look through this extract C in previous questions. Essentially what he's talking about is how BT were exploiting consumers with higher landline prices, but the question does also say, have a look at figure 2. So let's see what figure 2 is showing us. So the monthly rental cost of telephone landline, and we have a key here. We have a little wholesale line rental. Wholesale line rental is the rental price BT Openreach charges telephone service providers. So what is this exactly showing? So if you have a look at the important things, BT Retail, the price they are charging consumers has been steadily increasing every single year. But now the prices that they can provide these services at, the prices they charge telephone service providers, has been decreasing. Essentially, what does that show? What does that mean for BT's costs? If they can provide it for lower costs and they're consistently charging consumers higher prices, of course, this means firstly their costs are reducing. And how does that relate to? And of course, in the end, these higher profit margins. But the main thing is, which is this bit, which are the costs are reducing. How does that relate to our diagram? Of course, you can therefore say our cost curves, which are AC and MC, would be decreasing. And if you wanted to be more specific, you could of course therefore say this is as variable costs are decreasing, and of course if variable costs are decreasing, both MC and AC will shift downward. Let's get started with the cost revenue diagram. To pick up the marks for the diagram, of course you need to draw a cost revenue diagram, then you need to shift. You need to show some shifts to pick up the maximum marks for the diagram. But in this scenario, we do not need to show both the increase in revenue and decrease in costs. So I'm just going to pick one. I am going to pick the increase in revenue, as I think it's a bit easier. If you have enough time, if you can be bothered, you can show them both, but you do not need to, and you can get 12 out of 12 marks here by just shifting your just basically showing an increase in revenue, which would be your demand equals AR curve and your MR curve shifting out. So let's get on with drawing this. So let's draw our original curve. So D equals AR. Just of course, this is a simple monopoly diagram. Nothing different, no added details. So AC then we have our MC curve, and let's finish this off with the profit maximization point. Of course, where MC equals MR, then we go down from there to find our Q max, the quantity at where we are profit maximizing. We would go up from there to find what this would now, we go up until we hit our D equals AR curve, then we go left, which will tell us the P max price. Then how do we find our profits? That's super normal profit. We go from Q max, we keep going up until we hit our AC curve, and this will now tell us our box of super normal profit. And now let's finish this off by showing how we would show an increase in revenue. Because of course, like I said, if there's what is the reason for a rise in BT's profit? They have merged, so therefore there's an increase in the firm's sales. They have more market share, therefore sales times price equals revenue, so therefore an increase in revenue. And like I said, whenever D equals AR shifts out, it will always cause MR to shift out also. So now let's shift out our D equals AR to now D equals AR1, and now MR. Just finishing off with our costs, of course. So how do you find your costs? You go from Q max 1, keep going up until you hit your AC curve, which will be just about there, and then we go left from there, which will give us now our costs, which are pretty similar to the last ones. But now this would therefore mean this is our new improved or bigger box of supernormal profit, which you would expect from increased revenue. So now I'm going to be very simple, state my point, of course include application. I'm probably going to go down the route of monopoly power, since of course I think the extract mentions have 35% market share. So let's get on with that. So one likely reason for the rise in BT's profits is the integration with EE, therefore meaning larger market share. So just for the application marks, I did a reference to the profits rose to 566 million, I think it's in the second quarter of 2017. But the way I'm going to continue on this chain of analysis, I'm going to quote the extract again. I think it mentioned that the market share has now risen with the integration with EE, has now risen to around 35%. If the market share is now 35%, what does that mean? It means they qualify as a legal monopoly. Thus, of course, if they qualify as a legal monopoly, it will therefore mean they have a degree of monopoly power. And of course, if you have 35% market share, it really does show in the market there may be a lack of substitutes. Therefore, it gives them a degree of inelastic demand. And of course, what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to an increase in revenues for the firms. While they have that monopoly power, they can increase their prices, and for consumers are almost forced to still buy from them since they have that degree of inelastic demand. Meaning that I'm going to quote how, meaning that demand equals AR shifts out to D equals AR1, and this will therefore lead to an increased box of supernormal profit. And of course, you could mention that that is one reason why BT's profits have now increased due to an increase in revenues. Just to put that in writing, 35% market share, thus, like I said, qualifies them as a legal monopoly. They therefore have that monopoly power, which gives them a degree of inelastic demand. So therefore, they can increase prices, as you can see on the diagram, of P max to P max 1, and it leads to an increased revenue from D equals AR, which is here, to D equals AR1. And that, of course, if you have an increase in revenue, of course, it means that you will have a larger box of supernormal profit, thus meaning that relating it back to the question, one likely reason for the rise in BT's profits is due to larger revenues. And now let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. Now, with regards to evaluation, the main point, of course, I'm going to mention is the blaring red flag, which is extract C, where essentially it's talking about how Ofcom had to step in and cause BT to reduce its prices, and of course with basically it's, the way it worked, the evaluation point. However, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation. As Ofcom have stepped in, they've decreased BT's prices. Thus, is going to really reduce the degree to which BT can therefore make supernormal profit, and could lead to actually a reduction in BT's profits instead of an increase in BT's profits. And of course, you can talk about other evaluation points, like something like time frame, as of course there's a massive bit of BT's revenue was older individuals, but now as the younger generation is getting older, they are more electronically literate, so they're better with technology, they're more technologically literate. Therefore, with the younger generation getting older now, they will not have the same degree of information gaps as the older generation, thus meaning that they will not be able to exploit the older generation as much, meaning that their profits could also reduce. But yeah, that's all you need for evaluation with this question. Like I said, with these cost revenue diagrams, if it explicitly mentions it, a lot of the marks in your question will be dedicated specifically to that diagram. So make sure you address it well. You, of course, don't make any mistakes with your diagram, and then make sure you include the diagram in your chains of analysis. Short chain of analysis needed, a few evaluation points, and that should be a concise and you could actually surplus this question where you could save a few minutes on this 12-mark question and then use that towards your 15-mark question. But yeah, let's now move on to that 15-mark question. Moving on to this 15-mark question. So, discuss methods of government intervention to protect consumers within utilities markets such as energy and telecommunications. So the two examples that are given us in the extract. Now, so what are some examples of government intervention, or as some of you may know it a bit better, what are some examples of regulation where the government or like the CMA can involve themselves in the market to regulate, to protect consumers? And a few should pop into your mind. This is, of course, part of the spec. It should be content knowledge you have revised. If you have not revised it, of course, flashcards are available and revision notes on the udoecon.com website. But the main things that come to my mind are things like profit regulation, where a regulatory firm, where a regulator steps in and regulates a firm's profits, isn't used as much anymore since, of course, due to the entire concept of the profit incentive. If you reduce a firm's profit incentive, it makes them quite inefficient usually. But then other things like price regulation, of course, the classic, where the CMA regulates the price, as you can see in this extract here, where the price has been regulated, where it's falling from £19 to £12 now. Then other things such as how we can encourage small firms, things like reducing competition, deregulation. Why? Since there's a whole chain of analysis which can develop on that, where if we reduce the barriers to entry in markets such as energy and telecommunications, new firms will enter the market. That increases the contestability in the market, thus increasing the levels of competition in the market, which leads to several benefits. And things like merger policy, or just providing like startups with the loans, things like that. So there's many different ones you can talk about here, but which are the ones I would pick here with regards to government intervention to protect consumers? Now, when protecting consumers, what is the main way consumers are being exploited in most of these markets? What is the main theme being of this extract? Of course, it's been with prices. So we want to stop consumers being exploited via prices. So how can we stop consumers being exploited via prices? Of course, the CMA can regulate them. And how can they regulate them specifically on price? What can we include there? We can include something like a maximum price, where with a maximum price, of course, it sets an upper limit to how much firms can charge consumers, thus meaning that they are no longer being exploited. So that's a good one paragraph you can speak about, where the CMA can, and then of course you'd add a lot of the chain of analysis, a lot of the detail of monopolies, where you can talk about these firms have this degree of monopoly power, they're able to exploit consumers, thus the CMA have to step in to protect consumers. They regulate the prices by setting a maximum price, thus meaning that consumers, of course, are no longer being exploited. There's many other points you can speak about here, things like stopping anti-competitive practices. So the CMA sometimes intervenes in markets to stop firms limit pricing, predatory pricing. Why? Of course, as the name suggests, these are anti-competitive practices. They stop new firms entering the market. So the CMA comes in and regulates them to stop incumbent large monopolies doing this. And other things like demerger policy, or stopping the merger occurring. Things like providing new startups with loans could also be used. But what would I pick for my paragraph points? Of course, the main paragraph point I am going to talk about is just CMA regulating. And if you think about the theme of the question talk about how we're going to protect consumers. What is the main way consumers are being exploited here? What has been the main theme of our extracts? Since if you look back to the question before, we're thinking about profits. So the main way consumers have been exploited in this extract is, of course, prices. That prices have risen too high, and why is that? Of course, since, and the way I'd link this to is BT / these type of energy telecommunication firms have monopoly power, and they use that monopoly power to exploit consumers. Thus the CMA has to regulate, they have to do some sort of price regulation, and the price regulation I would talk about, an appropriate policy we could use, is of course maximum prices. So we could set a maximum price, of course, says the upper limit to how much firms can charge consumers. Thus if we set that maximum price below the equilibrium price, it means that consumers, you could say, are now no longer being exploited. This is a really good point to mention for your first paragraph. But another thing, like we mentioned earlier, another policy the CMA or the government could intervene and use is something like increasing the levels of competition in the market, and you may call this deregulation. So deregulation will mean firms can enter the market more easily. Why? Since there are less barriers to entry. Things like legal barriers, patents, copyrights, trademarks. If you get rid of things like this, especially in a market such as an energy market, if you get rid of things like the legal barriers, it can really help new starting firms to enter the market. And you can see how this chain of analysis will develop as it leads to better prices for consumers, maybe better quality for consumers. But now let's go into depth with these paragraphs and let's see how I would write these out. Let's get started on this first paragraph, and like I said, we're going to do it on maximum prices. And what else can we call a maximum price in terms of like energy markets? We could also call it a price cap. And for some of you that do know, RPI plus K, RPI minus X, that sometimes just pop up in extracts here or there. So that's a good thing to know, but it's not required knowledge. But with maximum prices, how we're going to show this on a diagram, I am actually going to draw two diagrams here. I'm going to draw one cost revenue diagram and one maximum price diagram, since I'm just going to add a bit more detail into why the CMA is regulated. So talk about how these firms in energy, in telecommunication markets usually have this monopoly power. They can exploit consumers. Thus, it's necessary for the CMA to intervene in the market, the government intervention, to then stop this degree of monopoly power, stop these firms exploiting consumers. But anyway, let's get started with this maximum price or price cap diagram. So of course, it's just simple supply and demand diagram. Then where would we set a maximum price? And this is all to do with the equilibriums. So equilibrium currently is at PE and QE, but now we will actually not label QE for now. But why are we setting a maximum price? We are setting a maximum price since the price at equilibrium, the current price in the market is too high. Therefore, we want to set the new maximum price. The maximum price needs to be lower than the equilibrium price to have any effect. Since if we set the maximum price here, this will therefore mean what? It will mean that prices will still go back to equilibrium, meaning that it has no effect on the market. So we always set maximum prices below the equilibrium price, label that P max, and let's see what this causes in the market itself. So we label this QS, and then we label this QD, and of course, since prices are lower than equilibrium, you could also comment on maybe an evaluation. This leads to excess demand. But that is the first diagram, and the second diagram, of course, is going to be a simple cost revenue diagram. So back on with the paragraph. One method that the government can intervene to protect consumers is by setting maximum prices or a price cap. And the bit of application I'm going to include is way back to extract A, where we do talk about a price cap, where the government claimed that this price cap could save households up to £100 a year, and that is a bit of application I am going to use. So my chain of analysis now is going to go pretty much, I'm going to focus this paragraph on the energy market. So I'm going to talk about the big six, of course, in energy, things like firms like British Gas. British Gas has a market share of around 25%, which again would classify it as a legal monopoly. I'm just going to start off with mentioning how the British Gas has this monopoly power, therefore it can profit maximize where MC equals MR. And thus, what is the big thing about monopolies? They are price makers. That is what monopoly power is. They're price makers, thus can set their own price, and they use that price making power, that monopoly power, to therefore charge price Pmax, which is to consumers being exploited. As we know, if you want to show this on a diagram in monopolies also, this triangle here represents, what does it represent? It represents welfare loss due to monopolies profit maximizing. So you could also reference that in your extract. So I've given a bit of context on why the government need to intervene. Now I'm going to talk about how they intervene. So therefore, the CMA or government would intervene in this market by setting a maximum price. And then I'm going to reference this diagram a bit more. So then exactly how I walked you through it, I would go about it in that step-by-step manner. So the market originally is at equilibrium where PE meets QE. So at this point here, this is at the point where consumers are being exploited. Thus, when the government intervened in the market, they would set the maximum price. They would make these firms charge a price lower than the equilibrium price, thus meaning that, of course, what effects would that mean? If now consumers are being charged lower prices, it means things like consumer surplus, consumer welfare would increase and improve. And thus, as a conclusion, basically, consumers are being exploited to a lesser degree. Why? Since prices are now lower. And one of the main things I've not mentioned yet is, of course, all this links into protecting consumers. It all links into allocative efficiency. And of course, with consumers being exploited, it is a massive degree of allocative inefficiency. But for those top level students, what you can actually do, you can show this price cap on the cost revenue diagram itself. So the way you do that is essentially what you do. The point at where we are allocatively efficient, which is of course where MC equals AR, at that point, all you do is draw a horizontal line that pretty much goes through that point and label it price. You can literally label it P cap, and that would be the point, and that would be our price cap. Why? Since of course that would solve the allocative inefficiency, since now firms are charging the allocatively efficient price, and it is a lower price, thus meaning consumers are no longer being exploited. So it's a really good thing to mention in these paragraphs, and a really bit of a good added detail you could mention here. And this also means this green triangle we've drawn of deadweight loss will also disappear, where we'd gain a bit of consumer surplus back, and then the deadweight loss would itself disappear. So it's a really good thing to mention, and a really substantiated, great argument here. Okay, so I've written most of that up, but now moving on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph, I am going to mention, of course, we talk about price caps, and with price caps, a great one to always mention is regulatory capture. So like I said before, you can talk about RPI plus K, RPI minus X. There's some popular price caps. It's good information to know. But essentially, what does regulatory capture mean? It means that the regulator becomes fond of the firm they're regulating, and maybe they don't set the K too high, or they set the X too low. So essentially, the price cap is not where it should be. So maybe this P cap here is not at the allocatively efficient price, as the regulator has fallen fond, therefore somewhere around here. Thus, of course, limiting limiting the positive effects to consumers, limiting the degree of allocative efficiency we gain, the consumer surplus, the consumer welfare that benefits. So the way I'd word it, Howard evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulatory capture, and then I will talk about how regulators, if they fall fond of the firms they are regulating, they may set K too high or X too low. And if you have no idea about what I mean by them, it's good to research these. So RPI plus K and RPI minus X. There's some good price caps just for a bit of added knowledge to research. And of course, another great evaluation point you could mention is what we're assuming here. And remember, always think about the assumptions we're making. The big one is that British Gas will be profit maximizing. You could say, however, evaluation, this depends on a business objectives. As a business, they could be profit satisfying, for example, thus reducing the degree to which they are actually exploiting consumers. Since if they're profit satisfying, they could actually be charging closer to that allocatively efficient price, thus meaning the degree to which consumers are exploited or the degree to which a maximum price will improve consumer welfare is limited. And I don't want to overload here too much with the valuation, since of course you will not need 3 valuation points per paragraph, but the reason for a lot of these videos is just revision. So of course, for different questions, not all of these evaluation points will be relevant, but maybe 1 or 2 of them will be. Therefore, you can apply these evaluation points you've learned, you've revised to different questions. So another evaluation point for this, of course, is we're talking about government regulation, and whenever the government intervene in the market, there will also always be a degree of government failure. It's a great one to mention. You can talk about how the government could have, the opportunity cost of the government introducing a maximum price here. Of course, there's lots of admin costs associated with the government setting this maximum price. Have they actually improved the conditions in the market? Are we now at the socially optimum point? And is there better policies we could have used instead of setting a maximum price here? So it depends on the degree of government failure. So the way I'd word it is, however, evaluation, this depends on the degree of government failure, as the government would have dedicated significant admin costs, significant time to implementing this maximum price, and it may not be at the socially optimum point, it may not be at the best point for society, thus meaning that the government have intervened trying to improve the allocation of resources, but it's actually overall led to a misallocation of resources. But yeah, that's how I'd evaluate this paragraph, and now let's move on to the second paragraph. Moving on to the second paragraph, and this paragraph is all going to be about how the government can intervene to protect consumers via, and this one way the CMA/the UK government does it, they increase competition within the market. And how can we increase competition within a market? We can do that by a concept called deregulation. How does deregulation increase competition within the market? As deregulation, for example, if we're reducing regulation, this links entirely to barriers to entry. It means the barriers to entry within the market are lower, and if the barriers to entry within the market are lower, this means there's increased contestability, and if there's increased contestability, what does that mean? It means it's easier for firms to enter the market, thus this should and this will lead to an increased level of competition, as it's easier for firms to now enter the market. A specific example you can give with regards to the telecommunication industry is radio licenses. So they're called radio spectrum licenses, and essentially all the big firms buy them, and this is how essentially the mobile networks work within the UK. But one way the government can help new entrants enter the market, make it easier for new firms to enter the market, which of course we'll explain later on why it helps, why it protects consumers. But one way the government can intervene to help this out is they can allocate some radio spectrum licenses specifically for new entrants. As usually what happens is that the big incumbent firms like Vodafone, EE, they essentially end up buying up all these radio spectrum licenses, and new firms don't even get a chance. So the one way the government can intervene in the market is allocating some just to new entrants, which would of course lower barriers to entry, thus increase the levels of competition within the market. So we've ended that chain of analysis saying more competition. But what does more competition actually mean? And let's try to be as step by step as possible, squeeze as many marks, as much information from this chain of analysis as possible. So more competition will mean there's more firms competing in the market. And what does that mean? It means there's more firms competing for customers. And if there's more firms competing for customers, let's think about the new entrants versus the existing firms, so the incumbent firms. This means the new firms will be essentially stealing demand away from the incumbent firms, since these new entrants will enter the market, maybe set a lower price and steal customers away from these incumbent firms such as Vodafone, such as O2, such as EE. So let's try to look at the cost revenue diagram now of an incumbent firm when the government deregulates the industry, and it means that more firms enter the market. So of course we have our normal just monopoly diagram, D equals AR, so let's just quickly level this up, D equals AR, MR, MC. We have this box of super profit, of course, Qmax and Pmax. But now, what do we say? So that new firms will enter the market and steal these incumbent firms demand away. So they're stealing customers. So how can we represent that on the diagram? Of course, that is going to be shown by your demand curve shifting inwards. Since why? If other firms are stealing your demand, this means demand will of course decrease, and same thing with MR. So now let's see the effect on price this has. So let's see the effect this has on price. So price will now go from Pmax to Pmax1, and of course a lower quantity as well. So why do you think this is? This is because new entrants are entering the market, they're stealing demand away from the incumbent firms, therefore these incumbent existing firms now are forced to lower prices to remain competitive within the market. Now, what is the aim of this question? What we're trying to actually answer in this question, we're trying to answer whether government intervention can protect consumers, and of course by firms now being forced, these existing incumbent firms, these oligopolistic firms being forced to lower their prices, this would therefore, we would say this is protecting consumers. Why? Since if you think about concepts like consumer surplus, allocative efficiency, with lower prices, we are definitely improving the consumer surplus in this market. So yes, you could conclude this paragraph by saying, yes, by government intervening, by them deregulating, new firms enter the market, steal existing firms, demand away, thus causing these existing firms to be forced to lower their prices to remain competitive, thus meaning overall the outcomes for consumers would be better. Why? Since prices are lower, thus an increase in consumer surplus. Another massive thing you could comment on, of course, you can comment on productive efficiency, but also these large incumbent firms have these boxes of supernova profit. What you could also mention is that these new firms entering the market, this new competition, this new competitive drive forces these incumbent firms to reinvest more of their supernova profit into research and development, thus increasing the degree to which these incumbent firms are now dynamically efficient, as they're almost being forced to innovate to maintain their competitive edge, to maintain their market position, to maintain their market power. They have to spend more, they have to allocate more of their supernova profit into research and development to, like we said, to maintain that market share they have, to maintain that market power. And why is this level of competition positive for consumers? As when these incumbent firms will be investing into research and development, it will lead to better quality, of course, for consumers. So things like maybe network in rural areas, it will improve. Thus overall consumers will receive better quality products, but then also with better quality products it may lead to new production methods which are cheaper, which are more efficient. Therefore we could see a combination of better quality products at lower prices, which both of course would improve consumer welfare, improve consumer surplus. This is why I emphasize past paper practice. Absolutely perfect, a really good chain of analysis to practice, and one that is really likely to come up in some perspective in your exam. But now let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. And of course, just before we move on, of course, I've just been focusing more on the chain of analysis here. Make sure to use the extracts, include as much real world application as possible. Of course, when I was speaking, I was giving a bit more like include the examples of the real firms, include a few stats and figures, use the extracts. Of course, it's 50-mark question. You have the benefit of the extracts to use it to boost that application mark, to make sure you're hitting the highest levels for those application marks. Okay, so first things first, we ended the chain of analysis by talking about how these firms can, even though they're losing demand, they can still invest, the incumbent firms, they can still invest the remaining supernova profit into research and development. But then you can argue, a really good evaluation point to argue, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which these firms can be dynamically efficient. As, for example, if these new firms, this new competition steals away most of these firms' demand, thus their profits are really low, it will therefore mean they don't have much money to allocate to research and development, thus meaning that they won't be able to be very dynamically efficient, thus meaning, of course, it will reduce the long-run benefits for consumers, such as better quality and lower prices. You could really argue, however, in evaluation, you could even say this depends on the degree of competition, or you could say this depends on the degree of dynamic efficiency by incumbent firms. With regards to our second evaluation point, it's very much to do with the question, and what is the main aim, what is the main thing we're addressing in the question, which of course would be protecting consumers. The policy we've suggested to help protect consumers would be deregulation. But now let's think back to why this regulation was in place originally. Of course, the reason why this regulation was instated originally by the government would be something along the lines of trying to protect firms and trying to protect consumers. So by us removing the regulation, the way you can evaluate this by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether deregulation may actually harm consumers. As for example, it could lead to lower quality for consumers, and it could lead to like things like unsafe practices. For example, firms might start cutting corners. It may lead to firms that shouldn't really be in the market, who maybe don't have the capital, who don't maybe produce the quality that was usually required by regulation to produce. They could now enter the market, and in the end, who does it affect? in the end, it's going to affect consumers. Maybe in this scenario, it's going to lead to unreliable networks, maybe instability, where since there's not much regulation in the market, new firms enter the market, they become established, and they're not run well, and they leave instantly, thus meaning that consumers have to constantly switch networks. And overall, these would of course lead to worsening consumer outcomes. So deregulation is always a bit of a tricky one whether to pursue or not, since of course there is a reason why this regulation was originally instated, and it was originally instated for the reasons to protect consumers. So by removing it, a massive consequence could actually be at least to harm for consumers rather than benefit, like we suggested in the paragraph. And of course, you can mention how other policies could be more effective. Things like stopping anti-competitive practices, demerger policy could work better than something like deregulation. But yeah, there's lots of different evaluation points here. Even things like we mentioned in the last paragraph, government failure, the degree of government failure, short run versus long run, think about the time frame. Lots of different evaluation points here that you can focus on into. But that is where I'm going to wrap it up for this 15-mark question. That is section B for this 2019 paper 1 done. And let's now move on to the section C, the 25-mark question. Section C, 2019 paper 1. Let's get right on with this 25-mark question. So, with reference to an industry of your choice, like I always say, this is why we emphasize real-world application so much, since in these 25-mark questions, you can get questions that specifically ask you from your own knowledge, since of course, remember, in these section Cs, there are no extracts, so using your own knowledge, you need to be able to refer, add stats, add figures about real-world application. But with reference to an industry of your choice, evaluate why wage differences exist within the UK labour market. So great question, pretty much about wage differentials, so why individuals are paid different wages. Let's have a read of the stimulus. In July 2017, it was announced that only 1/3 of the BBC's 96 top earning presenters were women, and that its seven highest paid presenters were all men. A good stat to back this up. Who do you think is the highest paid presenter for the BBC? It was, in fact, well, he's not anymore because he doesn't work for them, but it was, in fact, Gary Lineker, who was used to be paid around 1.1 million, and of course, that was for Match of the Day, things like FA Cup commentating. But yeah, and according to the High Pay Centre, in 2018, UK chief executives can earn 120 times more than the average full-time worker, earning £28,758. So essentially, CEOs can make around 120 times more than an average worker. Labour market question. Let's get started with this question. Labour market questions, in my own experience, and even through the exam statistics, just students tend to avoid labour market questions. That is because, yes, of course, it is a bit of the smaller side of the spec, but I really think these questions are much easier than the other questions you can get for your 25-mark question, and it's just that since students avoid them, and especially when you're practicing past papers, 100% make sure you do the labour market questions, since if you get good at labour markets, it can be really easy to pick up the marks. And for example, the other 25-mark question could require you to know a lot of detail, could be very specific, and in my experience, labour market questions are just a lot easier than the other 25-mark question. They're always really simple, straight to the point. This is the same advice I give in the macro side of things for like the development globalization side. It usually is exactly the same thing where students really tend to avoid it, but the questions are a lot easier. So essentially what I'm saying, if you get good at these little sections, you can answer an easier question, thus meaning that it's a lot easier to pick up the top marks. So in this scenario, instead of having a massive depth of knowledge, since the other 25-mark questions about collusion, that's going to really differentiate the top level applicants from the lower level applicants, because the high level chains of analysis will just be totally different. So by you practicing these unpopular topics like labour markets for micro, like globalization / development for macro, you can almost answer an easier question, thus making it easier for you to pick up the top marks, if you kind of get what I'm getting at. But anyway, let's get started with this question. The reason why students find this difficult, the first thing they'll think about with wage differences or wage differentials is, of course, the first thing that pops into most people's minds is like the men versus women debate, where, of course, historically men earn more than women. But honestly, for your A-level, I wouldn't really use as much, since there's not much economics you can really add to it. There's not much theory you can add to that answer. I would use it if it's relevant in evaluation. Of course, that is a example of, in some scenarios, wage discrimination where two individuals do the same job, but due to genders, one is paid less. It's a good evaluation point, saying how in evaluation, this depends on the degree of wage discrimination. Of course, there's many different types of wage discrimination due to sex, gender, age, disability, etc. But I think a really good one to focus on, especially since we're referring to UK labour markets. And of course, currently, as I am doing this paper, it's 15th of November of 2025, and there are actually doctor strikes right now, so it's very relevant. But the first point, my first point would of course be, if we're referring to doctors, is monopsony power. Now I've mentioned it a few times, but it's very clear that Edexcel do not require you to learn the monopsony diagram, but 100% every single one of my students, I advise learn the monopsony diagram, unless it's like 3 days before your exam and you're watching this. But if it's any time before, do learn the monopsony diagram. It really adds a lot more depth to this essay, and you can really pick up the top marks with it. So we'll get started now with a monopsony diagram. So let's go through what actually is a monopsony. So of course, a monopsony is one dominant buyer of labour in the market. Let's get started with the axis. So on the y-axis, of course, it is just a classic labour market diagram. We have wage on a y-axis, then quantity of labour on our x-axis. Now, let's get started with our demand curve, and you just need to remember the label essentially. So demand, and this is a very popular topic, we will be, it's probably going to be our second paragraph point, which is MRP. What does MRP mean? Marginal revenue product, the additional revenue gained by a firm hiring one extra worker. Now that is a very, very good paragraph point itself to speak about. We're not going to go too much into depth with it with this paragraph, since of course we want to focus on the monopsony. Well, that is probably going to be my second paragraph point. A really good example we are going to walk through, since of course it is saying to refer to an industry of your choice. A great example with regards to that is of course footballers. You can give any example of any footballers, but like if you think about Erling Haaland versus the other Premier League strikers, I believe Erling Haaland's new contract, he's earning about £550,000 a week, whereas the average Premier League striker makes around £80,000 a week. One of the biggest reasons for that difference is Erling Haaland's MRP is much higher than the average Premier League striker, but we'll probably do that in the second paragraph and we'll break that down in much more detail. But anyway, let's finish off this diagram. So then we have our supply curve, and supply curve in this scenario means equals the average cost of labour, and then I'm trying to make that a bit smaller, and then we have our last curve, which is the marginal cost of labour. Now continuing on with the healthcare application in the UK, and this all is detailed in the fact files in the real world application packs on the UDO Econ website. But in the UK, doctors make on average, of course, which is a monopsony, of £80,000, whereas if you contrast this to a more competitive labour market, essentially a non-monopsony labour market, which is the US, the average physician, or what we call a doctor, makes around £250,000 to £300,000. So it really shows how much and the degree of monopsony power affects wages within the UK. Let's get started with the chain of analysis. So the National Health Service, the NHS, are the single dominant buyer of labour within the healthcare industry. For example, for doctors, they hire over 90% of all doctors within the UK. This essentially creates a catch-22 for doctors. So since the NHS are the dominant buyer of labour in the healthcare industry, doctors either have to accept the NHS's lower wages, or they just have to face unemployment, since there's essentially there's pretty much no other employers within the UK healthcare industry. And of course the UK has a very small private healthcare industry, but like I said, it's extremely small, and for the most part, either doctors accept the NHS's low wages or they face unemployment. And how can we see these low wages on the diagram? So let's go back to this monopsony diagram and investigate it even further. So where do firms, we say profit maximize, but in this scenario we're talking about wage maximization. It's just the same as before. It's where we profit maximize, where MC equals MR. That is also where monopsony's wage maximize, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So where is MC equals MR? So we have MC of labour here, and we have MR, and of course it's P, but that is where MC equals MR at this point. This is the wage maximization point, and let's just go down to find out what wage and what price this is. So we're going to label this W1 and we'll label this Q1. But essentially, this is the wage now, W1, the NHS could pay doctors. This is the wage they should pay doctors within the UK. However, this is of course not the wage that doctors receive within the UK. Why? Since of course we know that the NHS has the power. They're one dominant buyer of labour within the UK. Therefore, they can use that power, they can use that monopsony power to exploit workers, exploit the doctors. So therefore, instead of paying wages at W1, they use, and this is the reason, relating back to the question, we have a wage difference. It is due to the monopsony power. And where do we see this monopsony power? They go from W1, well, they go from this point, and they keep going down until they hit their supply equals average cost of labour. And we go left from there. And this will give us W3, and now this is the wage doctors actually receive within the UK. So the NHS, they exploit their monopoly power to push wages down from W1, which they should be paying doctors, to actually paying doctors W3. Another great thing about this diagram is within the monopoly diagram, you can also show how a competitive labour market would perform. So for example, like we said, the UK is a monopoly labour market, whereas the US is more competitive. And we can show this, where would a competitive labour market reach equilibrium? Of course, just where a normal market reaches equilibrium, where supply equals demand, which is at this point here. Therefore, we'll label this Q2, and we'll label this W2. Therefore, essentially, with this monopoly power, it shows that the NHS is also able to drive wages below the competitive wage. They're able to drive wages down below the wages that would be paid in a competitive labour market. And of course, due to low wages, of course, what is another side effect we see is that there's less quantity supplied of labour. Doctors want to work less. Why? Since they feel like they're not valued, they're not getting paid enough. And of course, that contributes to lots of the problems we see within the UK, which is a massive one, which is doctor shortages, where there's not enough doctors in the UK. And a massive reason for that is that we just don't pay our doctors enough. And pretty much with regards to this paragraph, with regards to the question, you can cut it off there. But what a bit of detail I am going to add is, since we're talking about, and since we mentioned the competitive labour market, I am going to contrast it with the US, since I think it gives a really good bit of depth and a really good bit of application as well. So very simply, all I would add is, in contrast, the US has thousands of private hospitals, thousands of private clinics. This creates a more competitive labour market compared to the UK. Therefore, you can see this is represented on the diagram. Wages are more fair, where you can see it, and they're more allocated by the market. It's the price mechanism that allocates the wages, where we see wages are pushed up from W3 to now W2. Now, moving on to the evaluation points. So in this paragraph, we have spoke about monopsonies. Now, a classic A-star evaluation point, this I always suggest students, with the classic evaluation points, I would just always make a flashcard on it. So whenever you're writing about monopsonies, it should just be in your mind, okay, the best evaluation point, an A-star evaluation point here is just always, and in this scenario, is trade unions. Sometimes it's a density of trade unions. In this scenario, I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of trade unions, since of course, what do trade unions do? They use their collective bargaining power to therefore negotiate higher wages. And in the example of healthcare within the UK for doctors, the trade union is the BMA, the British Medical Association. And recently, the reason why the doctors are on strike right now is that they're fighting for full pay restoration. And they recently did get a better deal with regards to their pay. I believe they got like a 23% pay uprise. So you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the effectiveness of trade unions. As for example, the BMA, the trade union for doctors within the UK, they've recently negotiated a deal with West Dealing, or just the healthcare minister, thus meaning that it decreases the degree to which the NHS can exploit their monopoly power. Since essentially trade unions can use a joint bargaining power to therefore mean that workers such as doctors are not being exploited. And that's how I would word that evaluation point. But remember, what I always suggest with evaluation, read through your chain of analysis and find any assumptions. One big assumption we make is that NHS is a dominant buyer of labour within the UK. This is true within the UK, but of course, we're not, globalisation has occurred, and we're not only constricted to the UK. So the way my second evaluation point would be, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of labour mobility. As currently and it's one of the main problems with the UK workforce, the doctors' workforce, is that around 4% of all doctors are leaving the UK to work in other countries with essentially higher wages, such as a popular one is Australia or Gulf countries like Qatar. But now let's relate back to the question. What does this mean for NHS's monopoly power? So the workers' international mobility, it weakens the NHS's monopoly power. Why? Since now these workers have alternative options. They can now go and practice in countries like we said, Australia, Qatar, where they have higher wages. So it means that they're not just constrained. They don't only have an option to accept the NHS low wages or go unemployed. They can go abroad and pursue alternative opportunities. But that's a really good evaluation point. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the levels of labour mobility. And it's a great start to back it up as well. 4% of doctors leave the UK workforce each year. But yeah, that is how I tackle this first paragraph on monopsonies. Now let's move on to the second paragraph, which, like I said, I'm going to focus a bit more on this topic of MRP, marginal revenue product. Let's get started with the second paragraph. Like we said, it's going to be on MRP. So how would we define MRP? You see, additional revenue gained from a firm hiring one extra worker. And to go a bit deeper into the content knowledge, what equation builds up MRP? And you should know this, and it will be assessed. MRP, that would be MPP times MR. MPP standing for marginal physical product. For example, if we work in a cookie factory, is how many physical cookies the worker produces, then MR is the additional revenue gained from selling these cookies. So the amount of cookies times the revenue gained will give us the MRP, the marginal revenue product of the worker. So now if we transition back to the fundamentals of labour markets, the assumptions that all this content is based upon, I'm going to ask you quite a simple question. Why do firms hire workers? But try to remember the assumption that we learned back in micro very early on, that firms are all profit maximizers. We assume firms to be profit maximizers. So again, why do firms hire workers? The main reason firms would hire workers, and the answer is that they want the workers to add to the firm's revenue more than they add to a firm's costs. Now that sounds very simple, but a lot of students forget this, and like I said, chains of analysis is all about assuming your examiner has no content knowledge, being as step-by-step as possible. As if you guide your examiner through step-by-step how you've come to this conclusion, that is what chain of analysis is, and that is how the examiner can credit you those top marks, that top band of marks. But if workers add to a firm's revenue more than they add to a firm's costs, this will allow the firm to further the objective that they have, which is profit maximization. Now that helps answer the question, explaining why differences in MRP lead to wage differentials, or as the question words it, wage differences. Like we said, workers with higher MRP bring the firm more revenue. Thus, as they bring the firm more revenue, of course, they're more valuable to the firm. So the firm is willing to pay higher wages in order to firstly attract these workers and then retain these workers. Another great section of labour markets we can link in and comment on here are elasticities. So workers with higher MRPs are likely to be more rare. Why? Due to their unique skill set. And as we know, higher skilled labour is going to affect our labour market supply and demand diagram, of course, wage on the y-axis and then quantity of labour on our x-axis. Like I said, these workers with higher MRPs, they're going to have higher skill levels. Therefore, what is the supply of labour going to be? It's going to be relatively more inelastic. So we can draw our supply, which of course is upward sloping. It's a supply curve there, and then we'll just draw a normal demand curve, which is a normal downward sloping demand curve. Thus, what's going to happen to equilibrium wage? As you can see now, the labour market reaches equilibrium where supply of labour equals demand of labour, and you can see relatively this will be quite a high wage. Thus, high MRP leads to inelastic supply of labour, thus leading to higher equilibrium wages, which again is another reason, another link why high MRP, inelastic supply of labour, again causing another wage difference, or you can call it a wage differential. And that's a really good chain of analysis of how to explain why MRP leads to wage differences. But of course, for this paragraph, and it specifically does mention in the question, they want you to refer to an industry of your choice. So you do need to make sure you have quite a depth of understanding, quite a deep depth of understanding in a specific labour market industry, so you can apply all this knowledge, all this theory to the real world, thus allow yourself to pick up that top band of marks. As if you do not have enough detail of a real world example, it's 100% going to limit your marks, and 100% mean you cannot achieve the top band in terms of marks. And for those of you looking for an example with stats, I have taken a bit of time out, got a few stats together and written up an example. It's essentially the exact same theory we were speaking about before, just using a great example in the UK, of course, being the Premier League, footballers within the UK, and of course one of the better strikers within the Premier League, which is Erling Haaland. Of course, I think he recently signed a 10-year contract with Manchester City, and he makes around $500,000, well, even more than $500,000 per week. And this is essentially the A-level economics explanation of why Erling Haaland makes so much more than the average striker in the Premier League, where he makes over $500,000 and the average Premier League striker makes on average £80,000 per week. And of course, I might have gone slightly overkill on the application with the amount of Premier League goals, but you just need to make sure you have a decent example, a decent amount of depth from different areas of the labour market sector. So doctors is always a great one, nurses, very common in the extracts as well. Just a few different industries within the UK in labour markets, have a few stats to back it up, and that can really elevate these essays to the next level. Moving on to the evaluation for this paragraph, a great one, and like I always say, there's some, especially on the UDO Econ website, the evaluation flashcards. There are some points where, for example, MRP, there's just a pre-written, a pre-revised evaluation that I know of MRP. So whenever it comes up, the first thing that comes to my mind is the MRP evaluation flashcard that I've seen on the UDO Econ website. But what is this evaluation point? Is that MRP is extremely hard to accurately measure. Why is that? For example, we can't accurately measure how much, and in this applied example, how much extra revenue Haaland brings into Manchester City. For example, how many more sponsorships, how many more fans, how many more shirt sales. Some of them can be quantified and measured, but some of them, for example, we don't know how many extra fans come to games just because of Haaland. We don't know how many extra sponsorships want to sponsor Manchester City just because of Haaland. Thus meaning wage differences represent more subjective valuations. So they're just what Manchester City or the owners believe Haaland is worth versus how much his pure productivity, how much he's actually adding to the firm. So that's how I'd word that evaluation point. But I think as a second evaluation to wage differences due to MRP, I think you could really evaluate that MRP is not the main thing that causes wage differences. Rather, it is bargaining power. As for example, if we think about industries such as train or airline industry, such as train drivers, you could argue that train drivers are not the most skillful workers. However, due to the massive bargaining power, as we've seen by recent strikes, trade unions, they are paid a high equilibrium wage. You can contrast that with the opposite, where nurses and the healthcare industry, such as the social care industry, you could argue that these workers are highly skilled, highly productive. However, due to the lack of bargaining power, they are still paid low wages. So essentially what we're saying, the skills output of the worker does not lead to wage differences. It's actually just the bargaining power within the industry. So it's an interesting argument, definitely. Nonetheless, it works as a really good evaluation point. And of course, there's lots of different valuation points here. You can talk about non-monetary factors. Some of you may know it as non-pecuniary benefits, such as like longer holidays for like teachers, for example. And then other things such as discrimination due to race, things like that. They, of course, do play a factor within wage differences that exist within UK labour markets. But that is pretty much how I would answer this 25 mark question. Like I said, it's always good to practice these unique type of questions. Like I always say, labour markets is still fairly high yield with regards to your exam, so do make sure you practice it. But yeah, that is this question 7 and this 25 mark question done. Let's now move on to the next 25 mark question. Let's get started with this last 25 mark question. So, with reference to an industry of your choice, of course, showing the utmost importance of real-world application, evaluate why some firms engage in collusive behaviour. And the stimulus is an example of this firm, don't have to say that, Scania, a Volkswagen-owned truck maker. They fined 880 million for colluding with 5 other truck manufacturers over a 14-year period. And why did they do that? Due to the additional cost of meeting emission regulations. Now, as you can probably tell, this is an absolute classic market structured exam question, talking about collusion, of course, referencing oligopolies. Let's start with first, how would you define collusion? Collusion is, of course, the technical definition of it, when firms agree to limit competition. And of course, we can specify the two different types, which is tacit versus overt. The way I would remember these, the legal versus the illegal one, is tacit. Just try to remember it as tactical. If you're being tactical, it is not illegal. Overt, therefore, is the illegal one. But now, let's comment on the incentives. Why do firms turn to collusion? And there's lots of mini objectives within this, but again, very simply, what is the overarching reason that firms collude? And that would, of course, still be profit maximization. Of course, there are usually several other mini objectives within this, such as reducing the costs, increasing the revenue, things like reducing uncertainty, are all reasons why firms collude, but the overarching reason, if you put them all together, is usually to profit maximize. Also, let's try linking the other bits of information we also know, and this 100% is going to be one of my main paragraph points to address the question, as it is one of the main reasons why firms would engage in collusive behaviour. But now, what type of firms are colluding? We usually say they are, of course, oligopolistic firms which collude. And how do you define oligopolistic firms? It's usually a small number of large firms. We can sometimes say that the 4-firm concentration ratio should be between like 50 to 80%. Linking back to your content knowledge, when you're thinking about oligopolies, what sort of diagrams are you thinking about? Of course, there are two main diagrams when you're referring to oligopolies, and one of them is specifically to do with collusion. Of course, the prisoner's dilemma, the game theory matrix, and then also, it's not on the Edexcel spec, but a great diagram to comment on price rigidity, which is of course the kink demand curve. But first things first, and that's pretty much how I'm going to separate my two paragraphs. First paragraph is going to be on game theory. Second paragraph is going to be on price rigidity and why they both could lead to firms pursuing collusive behaviour. But let's get started with game theory matrix payoff grid. So let's get started with this first paragraph, and like I said, I've drawn in a game theory matrix diagram here. Like I said, the numbers, you can change them, but these are some good numbers to use if you do want to copy them. But the way I'd word my paragraph is the reason why some firms engage in collusive behaviour, and the point from a paragraph I'm going to give. So the reason why some firms engage in collusive behaviour is due to the profit incentive. And then I'm going to give an example. I'm going to say, for example, the 5 largest supermarkets in the UK, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Aldi, Morrison's, have a 5 firm concentration ratio of around 70%, which would then align with the definition that we have for oligopolies. But now let's explain the collusion using the game theory matrix diagram. And this is exactly how I want you to develop the chain of analysis. Don't just throw in, classic mistake I see every year by students, they just slap in a game theory matrix diagram. They don't really explain it much, and it really limits the amount of marks you pick up. If you're throwing in the game theory matrix diagram, almost like a flow chart, run through it with the examiner, explain why we go from originally being at high to then to the Nash equilibrium, and why we end up at low. So run through it with the examiner, and then that is the whole process of being step by step, and that of course allows you to pick up the higher marks for the chains of analysis. Both firms get started at pricing at high, and why do they do that? Why? Because firm A makes 10 billion and firm B makes 10 billion. And what do we call this point? Of course, at this point we have the joint maximum revenue, as both firms are maximizing their revenues as they're both charging a high price. Now you would imagine this outcome, both high is fairly stable, as it's in both firms' interests to remain at this point. But now, what are the incentives to move away from this high point? Let's investigate using this box here. So what's happening at this box here? So firm B has cut their prices down to a low price, whereas firm A has remained and kept their prices high. So what firm B have done here, they've decided, let us try undercut firm A and let's see what happens, and let's see the outcome of this. So the outcome of this is that now firm B is making 15 billion worth of revenue as they're charging a low price, compared to firm A, who remained at a high price, therefore is losing out and is only now making 1 billion. And what is this to do with? Why does this happen? Of course, one of the main characteristics and pretty much the biggest keyword in oligopolistic markets, of course, it is interdependence, where both firms' decisions directly affect each other, and even more specifically, where one firm's pricing decisions directly affect other firms' outcomes. And how can we see that? As for example, as when firm B has set a low price, their revenues have increased, but even though firm A has not changed anything, firm A has just stayed the same as it was here, but due to the interdependence, their revenue has fallen significantly. They've lost over 9 billion worth of revenue. So now we are at this position here. Let's think about the scenario for firm A. So what is firm A thinking? They have a high price right now and they have a massive loss in revenue. So what they're thinking, if we keep our prices high, they've lost demand, they're losing customers, like I said, massive loss in revenue, and over time, if they keep the prices high with all these losing customers, they're going to eventually lose market share. And they can't do that. They can't lose everything just to keep prices high. So firm A, and due to the interdependence, are forced to respond. And how are firm A going to respond? They're going to also lower their prices. So therefore, we will go from firm B having low prices to now also firm A having low prices, thus leading to this box here, which of course, what do we call this box here? When we follow the dominant strategy, this is called the Nash equilibrium, where both firms are charging the low price. Where can we see this? A really great example of this is within UK petrol markets. So the supermarkets in the UK, of course, also provide petrol, and we see when one of the supermarkets lowers the prices per gallon of petrol, we see within a few hours the others also respond. Why? Because they don't want to get out-competed. They don't want to lose customers. They don't want to lose revenue. But like I said, when they keep dropping prices, when they undercut each other, it will therefore lead to worse outcomes overall for joint revenue. Because as we see now, when they're both charging low prices, they're now only making 10 billion worth of revenue, whereas when they both charged high prices, they made double that. They made 20 billion joint revenue. And this is why the game theory matrix is perfect for collusion questions, as it very simply and very clearly shows the incentives for firms to collude. So if they don't collude, if they compete, they both lose out with only 10 billion worth of joint revenue, whereas if they collude, they can therefore achieve the joint maximum revenue, which is 20 billion in this scenario. And remember, if they're colluding, they also remove the chance of the other firm undercutting. As why? They've made a deal. They made a deal that they're both going to set at this high price. So theoretically, they can sustain this high level of revenue and these high prices. So therefore, what does this show? Due to the profit incentives, firms agree to limit competition, they agree to collude, as in the end of the day, it leads to maximum revenue for both firms rather than both firms losing out. Now, of course, in your chain of analysis, make sure to add in the examples. So like I said, supermarkets is a great one, even networks in the UK, so EE or 2, whenever one of these firms drops their prices of their contracts, they usually, the other firms follow. Why? Because like I said, they can't lose out on the customers. The interdependence means they have to change that low outcome. And then other examples like UK airlines, things like Ryanair versus Jet2, both budget airlines. When one of them drops the price, for example, from London to Barcelona, the other ones will respond by dropping them, as they do not want to lose out on customers. So lots of examples here, and just make sure the game theory matrix is slightly hard to initially understand, but once you've got the understanding, just keep repeating it. Make sure you can develop a really good chain of analysis on it. Make sure you're including those key terms like the Nash equilibrium, the joint maximum revenue, even things like interdependence, the dominant strategy, and you can really pick up top marks for questions on collusion if you know how to execute the game theory matrix diagram. Now, with regards to evaluation for this paragraph, I really think it's quite simple. Collusion has lots of evaluation points, lots of evaluation just generally with oligopolies. Of course, the big one and the main one is always going to be regulation. So how in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation. You can say the CMA regulation within the oligopolistic markets. Despite both firms being at the Nash equilibrium, despite both firms having a low outcome, they may not collude. Why is that? As they may fear CMA regulations, they may fear the name and the shame, they may fear getting named and shamed by the CMA by receiving these large fines. Thus, this may deter them from colluding and setting prices at high. When the CMA fines firms and they name and shame the firm, it can actually lead to quite bad outcomes for the firms. As for example, if they have ethical consumers, if they have consumers who have elastic PEDs, they could decrease their demand from the firm. As for example, they feel like they were being exploited. As for example, a great example of it when Starbucks, it's a bit different, but Starbucks were seen avoiding tax within the UK, I believe, and we saw a massive decrease in the quantity demanded from Starbucks as consumers felt it wasn't ethical for Starbucks to not pay tax in the country they're operating in. Therefore, things like that, things like CMA fines, can actually deter. Things like being caught colluding can definitely act as a deterrence for firms. So with oligopolies and specifically collusion here, I think there are an ample amount of evaluation points. But let's get started with the biggest one, which of course is going to be on regulation. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of CMA regulation. As if the regulatory bodies find firms colluding, they will name and shame them, and also they will receive fines. This could therefore act as a deterrence from firms. Instead of moving from the Nash equilibrium towards colluding, they may just stay at the Nash equilibrium and therefore not collude. For example, the fine they gain from the CMA could do them more damage than the revenue they possibly gain from colluding, and also being named and shamed. For example, this could lead to, if consumers see in the news that this firm was colluding and exploiting consumers, they therefore may receive a decrease in quantity demanded when consumers don't want to purchase from these firms anymore because they felt like they were being exploited, meaning that they lose their consumer base, lose demand, and again, lose things like market share. So it acts as a deterrence for these firms. So therefore, due to the consequences, it can deter firms from colluding. And also, let's try and be a bit more step by step and investigate this game theory matrix. So what we've assumed is that the first step was when we moved from high to high-low. But the main thing we're assuming here is that the only thing that firms are competing on is the price of the good. For example, these firms may not only be competing on the price of the good, they may also be competing on quality. Therefore, firm B, for example, in this scenario, firm B cut their prices, they set a low price, whereas firm A kept their high price. But, for example, firm A could be a very high quality, they may be a luxury producer. Therefore, despite firm B cutting their prices, it may actually have no effect on firm A. As for example, consumers may go to firm A due to their high quality, due to their luxury goods, instead of their price. So getting started with the second paragraph, like we said, this is going to be on the kinked demand curve. So let's of course start by sketching out the kinked demand curve. It's probably the most unique diagram, I would say, in one of the more unique diagrams in the A level, as it looks a bit different. So this, of course, like we said, it is just kinked. So this would be our D equals AR curve. Then how do you remember our MR curve for the kinked demand curve? This is probably the hardest one to remember. The way I'd start is just label that kink up. That is going to be your PE point, and this makes it a lot easier. Then label down, that is your QE point. This gives you a starting for your MR. So what would you do first? So initially your MR is twice as steep as your AR. So it goes like this. So you start from the same point, but it's twice as steep. So something like that. But then what happens after that? So now, this is where it is slightly unique. It is vertical for a small section. So then you just go down vertically for a bit. So it should basically follow that line. This is a bit weird. But now then, like I said, it's vertical for a bit. But now what happens at the end? Then just like the D equals AR, it essentially just juts out again and something like that. And that would now be your MR curve. Just remember, it's twice as steep until you reach this vertical section of your, basically the equilibrium. Then it's vertical for a bit and then again, it juts out at the end. And that is your MR curve. Now, you can show this in two different ways with regards to this. You can draw an AC, you can draw an MC, or what you'll see a lot, which is quite popular as well, is just two MC curves here, where MC2, MC1, both of them work. They both pretty much show the same thing. But now, back to wording the question. I'm going to say another reason why firms engage in collusive behaviour, as they have no incentive to change price. And that is represented by the kink demand curve. And why is that represented by the kink demand curve? Let's get started. So we're going to split this D equals AR curve into two separate sections. So we start with this initial section, which we call it is elastic. So back to the question, the way I'd word this paragraph, another reason why firms engage in collusive behaviour, as firms have no incentive to change prices. And now we're going to prove why firms have no incentive to change prices using the kink demand curve. Let's get started. If a firm increases prices. So great example to use with oligopolies, just for understanding, is Coke versus Pepsi. So let's say, for example, Coke want to increase prices, and let's see what happens. So we say Coke increase prices to P1 here. Let's see what happens to quantity demanded now. So now, a tiny increase in price, so PE increasing to P1, leads to a significant decrease in quantity demanded. Therefore, what does that represent demand is initially? As due to a tiny decrease in price leads to a significant change in quantity demanded, it represents consumers are extremely responsive. Therefore, this is elastic demand. But why is this due to? This is due to substitutes. So for example, in this scenario, if Coke increases their price, consumers, due to this goods are quite similar, consumers will switch directly to Pepsi. So as if Coke increased price to P1, instead of consumers buying Coke, they're just going to buy Pepsi instead. Therefore, Coke are going to suffer a significant decrease in quantity demanded, meaning that overall, if you think about it in terms of revenue, they will now be losing out as prices only increase a tiny amount, but quantity demanded has fallen significantly. And remember, how do we get revenue? Revenue is, of course, price times quantity. Therefore, our quantity has decreased massively and our price increasing a tiny bit. That, of course, is going to lead to a decrease in revenue overall. I actually have a full in-depth video on oligopolies. I think it's literally called the kink demand curve. It gives the explanation a bit better if you would like to watch that. But now, let's see the other scenario. If, for example, Coke thinks, okay, let me try undercut this firm. Let me try undercut Pepsi. What will happen? So we'll say Coke move prices to P2. And let's see now what is going to happen with regards to Coke. So let's see what happens. So a significant decrease in price. What is actually happening to quantity demanded? Quantity demanded increases a tiny amount. So just think about proportionally, relatively, how much the price is decreasing compared to how much quantity demanded has increased. So quantity demanded increases a tiny amount, whereas the price drop is massive. Therefore, what does that represent? Of course, it represents consumers are not very responsive to change in price. Therefore, we call this section of the demand curve inelastic. And the reason why this section is inelastic specifically is due to, remember, let's think about the game theory matrix and just oligopolies in general. If Coke decide to decrease price from PE to P2, Pepsi are forced to do what? Due to the interdependence, Pepsi are forced to also decrease prices, as that's why we only see a small increase in quantity demanded, as Pepsi are forced to do the exact same thing. They also have to now lower prices to P2 in response to Coke. And so the reason why this section of the demand curve is inelastic is due to interdependence. And the main thing here, again, what is happening to total revenue overall? Total revenue, again, what's happening? So we've had a massive decrease in price, and quantity demand is only increase a tiny amount. Therefore, again, total revenue is decreasing. So therefore, that's pretty much how I'd explain in this chain of analysis why oligopolies have no incentive to change price, and why they're price rigid, or you might hear price stickiness around this equilibrium point. As if they increase prices, what do you say? They have elastic demand due to substitutes, and if they decrease prices, they have inelastic demand due to interdependence. They lose out on revenue in both scenarios. Therefore, they are rigid, they are price stable around this equilibrium point. But now, why does this link to the question, why does this lead to collusion? And I would say this leads to more tacit collusion, so the non-illegal collusion. Why is that? As for example, if you think about the petrol market within the UK, Asda is usually the leader of the petrol market. They're the price leader. And what happens, and what we see with the real price data and in terms of real fuel prices, whenever Asda change their price, Tesco, Morrison, Sainsbury's, they all in real terms, in real time, as soon as possible, they try to change their price to follow Asda's price, as why they are the price leader, and therefore it leads to Asda's price stability around Asda's price, that oligopolies do not change price, and they lead to the stable tacit collusion price. So in summary, firms have no incentive to either increase or decrease price. These are price leadership where firms tacitly collude and just follow the price leader. Yeah, so with regards to valuation, we went through most of the evaluation points in the first paragraph. You could, of course, talk about how collusion is unstable, it's very likely to break down, cartels are likely to break down, talk about the long run versus the short run, talk about it depends on non-price factors, or firms could be competing. You talk about things like dynamic efficiency, how it affects consumers, lots of different evaluation points here, but we will leave it there. That's how to tackle this 25 mark question on collusion. That is 2019 paper 1 done. This paper took me incredible amount of time. In my opinion, I think this is definitely one of the more difficult papers in the exam series. It's kind of represented by the grade boundaries also, but yeah, it's a bit of a trickier paper, so a really good one for revision. And hopefully, any questions, make sure to leave it down in the comments. Make sure you do check out, hopefully it's up by now, udoecon.com website. Hopefully by this time, it's one of the biggest economics websites out there. But yeah, thank you for watching.